Hello,
Hello, everyone. Welcome.
all zero of the folks who are so far tuned in. Um, let
Oh,
let's get
it'll
cooking
be
because
it'll
people
be it'll be big on the replay.
it people tend to filter in. But today I thought it would be helpful to talk about uh, AI and truthfulness, especially large language models and truthfulness. So we have in previous episodes of the show talked about how you can get AI to produce helpful information by structuring your questions in a particular way so that it's more likely to produce useful information. But there's a difference between useful and truthful.
It's not trying for truth.
That's right. It's trying for relevant and useful, not necessarily trying for truthful. And the reason why that distinction is important is because not all of the relevant information that AI, especially large language models, have access to is truthful, or at least not everybody would consider it truthful. So I want to read from a recent paper that has one of the best academic paper names that I've ever read. The paper is called "ChatGPT is Bullshit."
I think paired with this paper should be the on bullshit, which we'll drop into the notes as well. One of the great essays of all time.
So I'll read briefly for folks who do wind up taking a look at this. It starts on page 4. So, quote, many popular discussions of ChatGPT call its false statements hallucinations. One might also think of these untruths as lies. However, we argue that this isn't the right way to think about it. We argue that these falsehoods aren't hallucinations. For now, we'll discuss why these untruths aren't lies, but are instead bullshit. The topic of lying has a rich philosophical literature. In Lying, St. Augustine distinguished 7 types of lies, and his view altered throughout his life. At one point, he defended the position that any instance of knowingly uttering a false utterance counts as a lie, so that even jokes containing false propositions like, I entered a pun competition, and because I really wanted to win, I submitted 10 entries. I was sure one of them would win, but no pun in 10 did. Even that would be regarded as a lie, as I have never entered such a competition. Later, this view is refined such that the speaker only lies if they intend the hearer to believe the utterance. The suggestion that speaker must intend to deceive is a common stipulation in literature on lies. According to the quote, traditional account of lying, to lie is to make a believed false statement to another person with the intention that the other person believe that statement to be true. And for our purposes in this conversation, that definition will suffice. Lies are generally frowned upon, but there are acts of misleading testimony which are criticizable, which do not fall under the umbrella of lying. These include spreading untrue gossip, one which mistakenly but culpably believes to be true. And it goes on to describe lies in a little bit more detail. But it starts to make an important distinction. Another class of misleading testimony that has received particular attention from philosophers is that of bullshit. That's why I love this paper. It's written, I just love the way this person writes. This everyday notion was analyzed and introduced into the philosophical lexicon by Harry Frankfurt. Frankfurt understands bullshit to be characterized not by an intent to deceive, but instead by a reckless disregard for the truth. A student trying to sound knowledgeable, having done the reading, without having done the reading, a political candidate saying things because they sound good potential voters, a dilettante trying to spin an interesting story. None of these people are trying to deceive, but they are also not trying to convey facts. To Frankfurt, they are bullshitting. I feel like that's a very useful definition.
Yeah. And the thing about bullshit is that it's just unconcerned with the truth. It's concerned with sort of looking smart or giving an answer, which is why I think that that ChatGPT is the ultimate in bullshit. Which sometimes, I mean, the thing I have to say about bullshitting is that sometimes you're right when you bullshit. I'm gonna give you an example of a time when I bullshat. and and uh, and I was right. I was working at a consulting firm, and we were doing a study on plastics, different kinds of plastics. And I had failed to do the research on this one particular kind of plastic, which I was supposed to have done. And we're in the meeting with the CEO of the company, and I knew the CEO was very interested in. He loved beer. And I also happened to know that I knew one thing about this plastic, which is you could pour hot things in it. And they were talking about milk, but I had a feeling that that wasn't and so I was like, the really great thing about this kind of plastic is you could pour beer into it. You could have beer in plastic bottles. And that, it turned out, I was bullshit. I was making that up. But as it turned out, I was right about that and looked, and was given all kinds of kudos. And I feel like, and to a certain extent, that was dangerous what I was doing, but it was also helpful what I was doing in terms of being a consultant. And I feel like that's sort of what ChatGPT does. It's like that kind of bullshit on steroids.
Yes. So the author of the paper or authors of the paper who are Michael Townsend Hicks, James Humphreys, and Joe Slater, they go on to distinguish between a couple of types of bullshit, which might be helpful here. So
Okay.
General definition of bullshit: any utterance produced where a speaker has indifference toward the truth of the utterance.
Yes.
Right? You don't care about the truth. Hard bullshit: bullshit produced with the intention to mislead the audience about the utterer's agenda or reason for sharing the utterance. And soft bullshit: bullshit produced without the intention to mislead the hearer regarding the utterer's agenda, meaning it's disregard for the truth, but you're not trying to accomplish anything by sharing it. So it's not like political in nature. You're not trying to convince somebody of something with an agenda underlying it. So the general notion,
bullshit with no intention.
I think the point they're making is that that ChatGPT, quote, is at a minimum a soft bullshitter or a bullshit machine, because if not an agent, then it can neither hold any attitude toward truth nor towards deceiving hearers about its, or perhaps more importantly, its user's agenda, right? So it doesn't have a model of truthfulness, and it doesn't have a model of the agenda, of its own agenda or the agenda of the audience. So when it's making stuff up, it's doing it in the soft way without with no purpose to mislead and no intention of tapping into the audience's agenda. Whereas a politician might be crafting an untruthful utterance with the intention of manipulating the audience.
Yeah. We have a user who shared promote your credentials, credibility, or agenda without necessarily focusing on what's true. So Jason, if I hear you, that might be the sort of the human version of bullshitting. A bullshit machine like ChatGPT might not be doing this to promote credentials, credibility, or agenda, but the intention might not be there, but they are not focusing on what's true. Is that an accurate kind of parsing there?
Yes, and I think the argument here is that at a minimum, the untruths that these AIs might generate fall into this category of like disregard for the truth, right? They just don't care whether the thing is true, whether or not they have an agenda associated with sharing that untruth. And the reason why
it does have an agenda, though, to give an answer that is useful.
Yes, and they go on to talk about that in the paper, which is like, why allow it to say untrue thing, right? To respond with untruths, because like in some cases, truth is noble, but they don't. It's not a consideration in the design of the current, especially chat interfaces for these large language models.
Yeah.
So is that really the question, is like, who is determining what the goal is? Like, is the goal, have we all just decided it's usefulness? Like, where did that come from?
Well, that, to Kim's point, that in some sense that is an agenda, right? Which is like it
Yeah.
wants to appear very useful.
Yeah.
Like if it produced responses that were completely useless,
Yeah. Yeah, it has
so
some criteria for
yeah,
determining whether it's doing well. I mean, it doesn't have it. We have given it a criteria. It doesn't have any criteria, but the designers of the system have given it a criteria of utility. I don't know how they measure that.
I mean, a lot of the measurements were frankly subjective measurements. Like they early on in OpenAI's history, they used a lot of human evaluators to
Yeah.
actually evaluate the quality of the responses
Yeah,
that it was
as did
generating.
Google for search quality. Hired lots and lots and lots of users to take a look at search results and make subjective determinations about whether they were good or not.
Yeah, I think ultimately, like the question is, do like if we accept that these AIs are not truthful, or like truthfulness is not a particular goal, like they may produce a true answer, but it would be almost coincidental
Yes,
that the
yeah,
answer is true.
yes, it is coincidental.
Uh,
And it's
Go ahead, Amy.
interesting, Jason, because well, I was just going to say that the conclusion of the article says, when you think about just this idea of what is I know, Kim, we don't want to go down semantic rabbit holes, but we can't stop ourselves. And it says calling their mistakes hallucinations isn't harmless. It lends itself to the confusion that the machines are in some way misperceiving, but are nonetheless trying to convey something they believe or have perceived. This, as we've argued, is the wrong metaphor. The machines are not trying, scrolling up to the top, they are not trying to communicate something they believe or perceive. Their inaccuracy is not due to misperception or hallucination. As we have pointed out, they are not trying to convey information at all. They are bullshitting.
Yes. That
So
seems
now
Yeah,
what?
that's not semantic. And
No, that's substantive.
who named it a hallucination? That's interesting.
I think that term comes out, like, predates any of the like commercialization of this. Is like a way that people referred to AI researchers referred to the mistakes that were being made. And my guess is that word was chosen rather innocently
Oh, I'm
to
sure.
but I think they're making a really good point about the implications of continuing to use that word, which is that it
Yeah.
perpetuates this perception that there was even an intention to attempt truthfulness, like
Yeah.
to try to perceive correctly, but there was neither an attempt to perceive nor to perceive accurately. Like that's I think the
Yeah.
really mind-bending thing about
Yeah.
the way these large language models work is essentially what they're doing is they're figuring out, they're looking for patterns in human language and sort of the likelihood that certain words appear together in a particular order. And that is relatively convincing, and often coincidentally produces useful, at least somewhat truthful responses, because at least the things we've recorded that the model was trained on often contain some kind of logic and or truthfulness. But the
Yeah.
more illogical and non-truthful things that are input into the system, for example, the reason why these systems suffer terribly from bias, for example, like they need significant correction, is because those biases, those not untruthful perceptions of a person or a group of people based on some characteristic, they're in the record.
Yeah.
That thinking is in the record, and so it reproduces that harmful not untruth, uh, unless it is actively corrected for.
How do we get past this feeling of kind of lack of hope that I feel from, like, how do we counter, is just knowing that it's bullshit is just a useful rubric, because it's like, okay, this is kind of designed as bullshit. It's just it's helpful as a global citizen to understand that.
Well, it turns out that a lot of what humans do is bullshit.
Yeah, we all bullshit all the time. Uh,
Uh,
uh, yeah, I mean, I just think this is an example of words matter. I don't feel hopeless that we've called it a hallucination when we should have called it bullshit. But I do think it is worth correcting the the language that we're using.
Well, I think that just to be clear, the part that feels like a correction is that the way that I interpret this conversation is that utility and usefulness was the priority and truthfulness is not the priority. So I don't, is that simplifying things or?
y- y- yes, and what I would say is we've talked, I think now 5 or 6 times, like almost in every episode that we've recorded, we've mentioned to some extent that you can't take what AI, specifically large language model AI, produces as fact. That anytime you're getting something back from the large language model, there's reason to be skeptical that that response contains either mistakes or untruths. But that doesn't make them not useful in the same. So like brainstorming is bullshitting. You know what I'm saying? Like when we brainstorm, we're like, that's what we're doing. Like we're like making these connections, and uh, the AI has the ability to do that across a huge like knowledge set. And that's really useful to like pull ideas from other places and like put them together in a way that you didn't necessarily think of. But the, the, it really falls down when, for example, like the lawyers who got in trouble for like generating their like legal brief through AI, and then it was citing cases that didn't cases in case law that didn't exist. Um, uh, we can't we can't take it literally to be factually true or accurate, because that's not the goal. And I think if we have that attitude when we use it, I think it allows us to take advantage of the good parts without
Mhm.
necessarily being harmed by the bad parts.
I think I mean, skepticism is always an important quality in people, and asking questions and doubting, I think taking information on faith is dangerous. And I think asking hard questions is important. And so I think that's just what we have to do with these large language models is employ you know, in the big five personality traits, agreeable to disagreeable, being disagreeable is more important than ever, uh,
Yeah.
I would say, in this world.
Jason, why do you think, I mean, and Kim, I know that you, when we talk about radical candor, we're seeing things from our own perspective rather than, this is how I'm perceiving the facts. You're perceiving the facts a different way. Is there a way that these LLMs could have been designed with more of a focus on quote truthfulness, or is that just inherently not possible?
I don't think that the current incarnate, I don't think so. I think the answer is like it's the technology that we are using. Um, it would be very very difficult to layer truth into it, because think about like you would need it would be like you need to add other vectors to each of those words in that context, and for that you would need a measure of truthfulness, and that's the like how do you make
Mm.
truthfulness into a number? It is the question, because that's really what's happening, right? So like imagine uh, as an AI is generating a response, it needs to figure out what word goes next. And essentially what's happening behind the scenes is that it's coming up with a map of probabilities based on the context that it has of what word should go next. And those probabilities are represented in a number, right? Some number between 0 and 1. And what we'd want is when the word is more likely to be true, for that number to be bigger than when the word is more likely to be untrue. But the question is, what is the objective? How do you objectify the truthfulness? You know what I'm saying? The truthfulness of like
Mhm.
that particular thing. And that I think it's probably achievable, but only for, but not trivially, without like really unwinding a lot of what makes the current tool useful, because it would shrink the data set so substantially that like it might actually produce significantly less useful responses.
And it would also require some subjective judgment on the part. I mean, and we already have. It's not that there's no role for subjective judgment in developing these systems. Obviously, when they hired people to assess whether the responses were useful, there was subjective judgment. But so I think we will figure out a way over time to layer some sort of fact checking into these responses, but it's going to take a long time before we're there. And it's also going to introduce like a whole other, anytime you're introducing subjective judgment into these systems, like that opens a whole other can of worms and gives a tremendous amount of power to the people who are making this subjective judgment. And do you want them to be experts? Do you want them not to be experts? Like, how do you answer that question? And you know, which experts are you going to choose if you're going to go down the expert path?
Kim,
Yeah.
can I ask you what's on your mind when you're saying about experts? You mean engineering expert versus a expert in
No.
philosophy?
I mean, if you're gonna, if you, let's say you were gonna build a truth layer into the who's gonna decide what's the
Yes.
truth? You know.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
Yeah, I think you would be. I know you that would you would like to be in that job.
I would not. I would not. You know, that takes us. This is why a lot of the, you know, what I'm thinking of as I'm saying this is even deciding, for example, what's porn and what's not porn when you're designing these systems is like super complicated. And truth is way harder to define than porn. Uh, and you know, I'll never forget showing up at work one day where I had to, there were these ads were showing up on a parenting website that was a AdSense customer, and the ads were for bestiality. It was like a and so they shouldn't have been showing up because they should have been classified as porn. So I called up the person in charge of the, you know, the manual override. There were a lot of automated systems that classified these ads, but then we had, and I got into it. This was not on my bingo card for what was going to happen at work that day. I got into an argument with this woman about whether or not bestiality counted as porn. And in her mind, it did not. And in my mind, it did. And so that's what I'm saying. Like it is really, once you insert human judgment, which you're going to have to, I don't think you even if you try to write an you know, a program.
The Supreme Court line was, you know it when you see it, I guess, which I'm not sure if that is applicable.
Yeah, and I was like, I'm seeing this and it looks like
yeah.
It's complicated, like it's more complicated than you imagine to like figure out. Whereas if it's pretty simple to say what's the next, on average, what's the next word going to be? I mean,
yeah,
that takes, I'm not saying that's simple, but it doesn't, it's not as fraught.
Yeah, I think the in some sense, because it is agnostic of the truthfulness of that thing, it's much more likely to choose a word that makes sense to the people who get the response. You know what I'm saying? Like,
So
because
it's being trained to be a really good bullshitter.
Yeah, and I think that's the part where they have a term for in the paper where they talk about agents. Like there are agentic actors in the world who we rely on. So human beings don't filter through all the information and then decide what is true. We rely on agents who we trust to be truthful with us to help filter that information on our behalf. And the dangerous thing is assuming that these systems are agents, like that they're making some attempt
which they're not.
at truthfulness, and it increases the importance of building these agents. So, like, another way to approach the truthfulness question is to have an agent separate from the LLM that is helping to determine what is truthful, and that could be an AI, and that, like, I could imagine some point in the future where there's a way for us to indicate the our frame for truth. So I might say, like, hey, I'm more interested in things that can be proven scientifically, for example. So that's science isn't so concerned with the truth as science is concerned with what we have proof for. So, like, I might say, like, that's the point of view, and then I could imagine an agent, an AI agent that says, well, here are the things that actually where there's evidence, like this is the answer you got from the LLM, and here's the evidence that either supports or refutes that point of view. Like, I could imagine some combination of things in the future that help us get at something beyond useful, closer to truthful.
But even then, you could imagine a world in which, I mean, for example, I was talking to this mathematician who said he was taking a look at the flat Earth math,
Yeah.
and he said the math, like, up to a certain point, is pretty good math. Like, you could imagine a world in which flat earthers insert their math. It looks credible to the system, and now you've got a liar. Like, once you're inserting the notion of the truth, you insert the opportunities for liars. Like, bullshitting is not lying, but I mean, I guess maybe the flat earth people really believe what they believe, so maybe it's not fair to say it's lying, but you insert the opportunity for prejudices to try to prove themselves in the LLM, and that's dangerous.
Yes, and I think, like, the reason I was using the scientific method as an example here is not because it's not that there's no scientific basis for believing in a flat Earth. There are some scientific bases for believing in it, but the preponderance of the evidence is that is incorrect, and that's the thing that I think, as AI becomes more sophisticated, it might be able to better assess, which is, like, to take an idea and then to help summarize the evidence that is available, like, on a computer, that either supports or refutes that point of view. That's not something an LLM can do, but that's something that AI could do in the
Top
future.
of the LLM. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know we're at time. I'm going to introduce an idea. Maybe we can talk about it next time. Like, to a certain extent, what these LLMs are doing is they're taking, like, all of human knowledge that it can access, which is a lot, all the books, all the internet, and they're going to give you, like, on average, this is how we would take this glob of knowledge and spit something back. I think that what we as human beings, a big part of how we move forward is we have the minority reports. We have an individual who thinks differently and then changes things. And so I think that our ability to question as an individual and is going to be more valuable than ever, not less, in this new world that we're creating. That's the optimist, anyway, statement. But it's like, I think it's time to go back and rewatch the Minority Report. That's how
That's your to do. Well,
yeah.
my to do. I mean, I think, just to close where we started, the last line of this research report said, calling these inaccuracies bullshit rather than hallucinations isn't just more accurate, as we've argued. It's good science and technology communication in an area that sorely needs it. So I think using that as a frame for me will
Yes.
continue to be highly critical in the purest sense of that word, discernment, and also encouraging us, like Kim, what I hear you saying is empowering us to really ask questions.
Yes.
Jason, what's your final takeaway? Anything to close on?
No, I think if our goal is to demystify AI, one way to help demystify AI is to talk about what it's really doing. And I feel like that was the point of today's conversation. So hopefully for the people who are listening, that came across. And you, like Amy, can think the next time that you're playing with ChatGPT about whether or not it is
Bullshit.
bullshitting you.
Yeah. Yeah. It is bullshit.
Hint,
Not
it
whether or not
is.
it is bullshitting you. And the question that you want to ask is this bullshit useful to me or not?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
All right.
All right, see everybody next time. Take
All
care.
right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.